There was one rule that every American medic in Vietnam learned the hard way. One warning that spread through every field hospital, every base camp, every processing station from Saigon to Da Nang. 5 words that no one dared to ignore. Do not touch their gear. They were talking about the Australians, about the men from the Special Air Service Regiment, about the operators who disappeared into the jungle for 12, 14 days at a time, and came back carrying rucksacks filled with things so disturbing that trained combat medics, men and women who had seen the worst injuries imaginable, physically could not handle what was inside. One nurse started screaming and never came back to Vietnam. A field medic refused to finish his inspection and was quietly reassigned the next day. A commanding officer with 2 full combat tours wrote in his personal log that he had never, in his entire career, encountered anything like it. And the Pentagon? The Pentagon classified everything. The reports, the comparisons, the medical evaluations. All of it buried because the truth about what those Australians were doing in the jungle of Phuoc Tuy Province raised questions that the most powerful military on Earth was not prepared to answer. How did 70 operators outperform entire American battalions? What methods were so effective that the Viet Cong abandoned their own trail networks out of pure terror? And what exactly was in those rucksacks that made hardened soldiers vomit on the spot? Today we are going to open those packs. We are going to show you what the official record tried to erase, what the Pentagon buried for decades, and what the Australians themselves never wanted anyone outside the regiment to know. If you think you know the story of Special Forces in Vietnam, you do not. Not yet. Stay with me until the very end of this one, because what you are about to hear will change everything you thought you understood about who really owned that jungle. In the spring of 1968, a 26-year-old United States Army field medic stationed at Long Binh was ordered to conduct a routine medical inspection of Allied personnel returning from a long-range reconnaissance patrol. The soldiers coming through the wire that morning were not Americans. They were 5 men from the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, Troop 3, D Squadron, who had spent the previous 12 days moving through the jungle of Phuoc Tuy Province without a single radio transmission, without a single resupply drop, and without leaving a single confirmed footprint on any known trail. The medic, whose name would later appear in a classified after-action psychological evaluation filed with the United States Army Medical Command, opened the first rucksack expecting the usual post-patrol contents: ammunition, rations, signal equipment. What he found instead made him step back from the examination table so quickly that he knocked a tray of surgical instruments onto the concrete floor. Inside the pack, wrapped in strips of dark green cloth cut from an enemy uniform, were items so disturbing that the medic refused to complete the inspection without a supervising officer present. The commanding officer who arrived 11 minutes later would write in his personal log that he had served 2 full tours in Vietnam, had treated casualties from Drang to Khe Sanh, and had never seen anything like the contents of those 5 Australian rucksacks. That incident was never reported through official United States channels. No formal complaint was filed. No disciplinary action was recommended. The medic was quietly reassigned to a different processing station, and the Australians walked back to their barracks at Nui Dat as if nothing unusual had occurred. But the story did not disappear. It spread through the American medical detachments like a virus, whispered in field hospitals and base camps from Saigon to Da Nang, always with the same warning attached. If Australians come through your station, do not open their packs. Do not ask what is inside. And whatever you do, do not touch their gear. That warning came far too late for dozens of American servicemen who had already discovered what the Australian SAS carried back from the jungle. And the things they found were far worse than anything the official record has ever acknowledged. To understand how the Australian Special Air Service Regiment developed practices so extreme that they shocked even battle-hardened American combat veterans, it is necessary to go back to the very beginning of Australia's involvement in the Vietnam conflict. In 1962, the Australian government quietly dispatched a small team of military advisors to South Vietnam under the banner of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam. These were not ordinary soldiers. Among them were men who had already served in the brutal counterinsurgency campaigns of the Malayan Emergency throughout the 1950s, where Commonwealth forces fought a vicious guerrilla war against communist insurgents in some of the densest jungle on Earth. The lessons learned in Malaya were not theoretical. They were carved into the bones of every man who survived that campaign, and those lessons would form the foundation of everything the Australian SAS became in Vietnam. The Malayan veterans understood something that American military doctrine of the 1960s simply could not accept. In jungle warfare, firepower is not the primary weapon. Patience is. Silence is. The willingness to become something less than human in order to hunt an enemy who knows the terrain better than you ever will is the ultimate advantage. The Americans built fire bases. The Australians built ghosts. But the difference between those two philosophies would produce results so dramatically different that the Pentagon would eventually classify the comparative performance data rather than allow it to become public knowledge. And the true shock was not in the statistics. It was in what those ghosts brought back from the darkness. The Australian SAS arrived in South Vietnam as a formal unit in 1966, establishing their base at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province. The initial deployment consisted of one squadron, roughly 70 operators, tasked with long-range reconnaissance and disruption of Viet Cong movement through the province. Within 6 months, the intelligence reports flowing from Nui Dat to the American command in Saigon began raising eyebrows that would never fully lower again. The Australians were producing actionable intelligence at a rate that no American unit of comparable size could match. Their contact rates were astonishing. Their casualty ratios were almost unbelievable. And the psychological impact they were having on the Viet Cong infrastructure in Phuoc Tuy was, according to captured enemy documents, devastating beyond anything the North Vietnamese command had anticipated. The Americans wanted to know how. The Australians were not particularly eager to explain. What the American liaison officers eventually discovered was a tactical philosophy so fundamentally different from their own that many initially refused to believe it could work. Australian SAS patrols operated in 5-man teams, sometimes for as long as 14 days without resupply, moving through the jungle at speeds that would make an American infantry platoon lose its collective mind. On some days, a patrol might cover fewer than 300 meters in 12 hours of movement. They did not hack through vegetation. They did not create trails. They moved through the jungle as if the jungle itself were pulling them forward, stepping only where the ground would not betray them, breathing in rhythms designed to prevent even the faintest sound from carrying through the humid air. But the patrol techniques were only the surface. It was what happened after contact with the enemy that truly separated the Australian SAS from every other special operations force in the theater. And it was those post-contact procedures that produced the items American medics would eventually find in those rucksacks. The first American to formally document the phenomenon was a Military Assistance Command Vietnam intelligence analyst named Richardson, whose 1967 field report would remain classified for more than 3 decades. Richardson had been assigned to evaluate Australian SAS operational methods as part of a broader study of Allied force effectiveness. He spent 3 weeks at Nui Dat observing patrol preparations, debriefing returning operators, and reviewing after-action reports. What he recorded in his classified assessment was so uncomfortable for the American chain of command that the original document was reportedly pulled from general distribution within 48 hours of its submission. Richardson noted that Australian SAS operators returning from successful ambush patrols routinely carried enemy equipment that went far beyond standard battlefield trophies. Every army in the history of warfare has had soldiers who collected souvenirs from fallen opponents: belt buckles, flags, insignia. These items are universally understood, even if officially discouraged. What Richardson observed in the Australian packs was categorically different. He documented the recovery of items that could only have been obtained through deliberate, methodical post-contact procedures carried out on enemy casualties under conditions where most soldiers would simply confirm the engagement and move on. And that was only the first layer of a story that would grow progressively more disturbing as the war continued. The items fell into several distinct categories, each serving a specific operational or psychological purpose that the Australians had refined through years of jungle warfare experience. The first and most common category involved enemy personal documents and identification materials. This might sound routine, but the Australian approach to document exploitation was anything but ordinary. While American forces typically collected documents from enemy casualties and forwarded them through intelligence channels in bulk, the Australian SAS operators had developed a system of immediate tactical exploitation that required them to conduct thorough searches of every enemy casualty within minutes of an engagement. This meant staying at ambush sites long after conventional military wisdom dictated withdrawal. It meant working in near-total darkness, by touch alone, sorting through the blood-soaked personal effects of men who had been alive moments before. And it meant carrying those materials, still damp, in their rucksacks for days or even weeks before returning to base. American medics who encountered these materials during processing described the smell as something that could not be compared to any other battlefield odor they had experienced. The combination of tropical humidity, decomposition fluids absorbed into paper and fabric, and the extended duration of patrol carriage produced a distinctive reek that several medical personnel reported triggered involuntary physical reactions. One medic stationed at Vung Tau described it as the smell of a butcher shop that had lost power for a week in the middle of a monsoon. Another said simply that it was the smell of the jungle itself, if the jungle were rotting from the inside, but the documents were merely the beginning. What came next in the catalog of Australian rucksack contents crossed a line that the American military establishment was deeply reluctant to acknowledge. The Australian SAS had adopted a systematic approach to psychological operations that involved the deliberate use of enemy remains as tactical tools. This was not the random battlefield souvenir collection that occurred in every army. This was a calculated doctrinal practice that had been refined through the Malayan emergency, tested in Borneo during the Konfrontasi confrontation of the early 1960s, and brought to its most extreme expression in the jungles of Vietnam. The operators referred to these items with a clinical detachment that American observers found profoundly unsettling. They were not trophies in the emotional sense. They were tools, instruments of psychological warfare deployed with the same methodical precision as a claymore mine or a rifle scope. The specific nature of these items varied, but the most commonly documented materials included enemy uniform components that had been removed in ways that indicated close quarters engagement, personal effects bearing biological contamination, and physical materials that American medical personnel categorized in their reports using language that left little room for ambiguity. The medics who processed returning Australian patrols used terms like organic battlefield debris, biologically contaminated tactical materials, and in one particularly blunt assessment, human origin field specimens. And still, this was not the most disturbing element of what the Americans discovered, not by a considerable margin, because the real horror was not what the Australians carried in. It was what they deliberately left behind. The practice that truly horrified American observers was the Australian SAS approach to what operators called trail signs. In the conventional military sense, trail signs are markers left by a patrol to communicate with follow-up elements, direction indicators, danger warnings, all-clear signals. The Australian SAS had taken this concept and twisted it into something that belonged more in a psychological warfare manual than a field operations guide. Their trail signs were designed not to communicate with friendly forces, but to terrorize the enemy. And the materials used to construct those signs came directly from the engagement sites where enemy fighters had met their end. Multiple American intelligence reports from the 1967 to 1969 period reference the discovery of Australian trail signs that incorporated enemy remains in configurations specifically designed to maximize psychological impact on Viet Cong forces, who would subsequently use the same trail network. The Australians understood that in the dense jungle of Phuoc Tuy Province, the Viet Cong relied on a network of established trails and way stations. By leaving specific markers at key junctions, the SAS operators could create zones of psychological contamination that would disrupt enemy movement patterns for days or even weeks after a single engagement. The American Military Assistance Command never formally acknowledged these practices, but the field reports tell a story that official history has worked very hard to bury. And the most chilling detail was the precision with which the Australians selected their materials, their placement, and their timing. One of the most extensively documented incidents occurred in November of 1967 when a 5-man Australian SAS patrol designated 32 Alpha conducted a 14-day operation in the Long Hai Hills, a notorious Viet Cong stronghold that American forces had repeatedly failed to pacify through conventional sweeps. The patrol was tasked with disrupting enemy communications and supply routes running through the hill complex. And they achieved this objective with a level of ruthless efficiency that stunned even the Australian command structure. Over the course of those 14 days, the patrol conducted 4 separate ambush engagements, accounting for a confirmed number of enemy casualties that remains classified to this day. After each engagement, the patrol spent what observers later estimated was between 45 minutes and 2 hours at each contact site, conducting what the after-action report euphemistically described as exploitation procedures. When the patrol finally returned to Nui Dat, the combined weight of non-standard materials carried in their 5 rucksacks was later estimated at nearly 11 kilograms. The American liaison officer who happened to be present during the debrief wrote in a personal letter that he had served with the most elite formations in the United States military and had never witnessed operators carry the kinds of items these Australians considered standard operational equipment. He did not specify the items in his letter. He did not need to. The implication was clear enough to anyone who understood what an 11-kilogram surplus from 4 engagements in the jungle actually represented. But the Long Hai Hills Patrol was merely one example of a practice that permeated the entire Australian SAS approach to jungle operations. And the roots of that practice went far deeper than Vietnam, far deeper than Malaya, and into a knowledge system older than any Western military doctrine ever written. The true origin of the Australian SAS relationship with what they carried back from the bush lies in 2 converging streams of influence that came together to produce something the modern world had never seen. The first stream was the Malayan Emergency, that savage 12-year campaign from 1948 to 1960 that most Americans have never heard of. In the swamps and mountains of Malaya, British and Commonwealth forces fought a guerrilla enemy who knew the jungle intimately, who could disappear into the green darkness like smoke, and who used terror as a primary weapon against the civilian population. The Commonwealth response, particularly from Australian and New Zealand SAS elements, was to meet that terror with something even more psychologically devastating. Not greater violence, necessarily, greater intimacy with the violence itself. The Malayan veterans who later commanded Australian SAS squadrons in Vietnam had internalized a fundamental truth about jungle warfare that American doctrine refused to accept. In the jungle, the side that is more comfortable with close quarters reality wins. Not the side with more ammunition, not the side with air support, the side that can operate in the intimate, suffocating world of the triple canopy without flinching, without hesitation, and without the psychological barriers that civilized training instills in conventional soldiers. The items in those rucksacks were not evidence of savagery. They were evidence of a military culture that had deliberately, systematically stripped away every psychological buffer between operator and enemy until there was nothing left but the pure mechanics of jungle predation. The Americans, with their vast technological superiority and their doctrinal emphasis on standoff engagement, found this approach almost incomprehensible. And what you cannot comprehend, you cannot control. But the Malayan inheritance was only the first stream. The second was far older and far more powerful. The role of Aboriginal Australians in shaping SAS tracking and hunting methodology adds another layer of complexity to this already provocative history. From the earliest days of the Special Air Service Regiment's formation in 1957, Aboriginal soldiers and trackers were integrated into training programs that drew on thousands of years of bushcraft knowledge. The tracking techniques taught at the SAS selection course in Western Australia were not purely European military methods. They were hybrid systems that combined modern military fieldcraft with ancient indigenous hunting practices that had been developed over tens of thousands of years in some of the harshest terrain on Earth. These Aboriginal-influenced techniques fundamentally changed how Australian SAS operators perceived the jungle. American soldiers were trained to move through the jungle as an obstacle to be overcome. Australian SAS operators were trained to move through the jungle as predators within their natural hunting ground. The distinction sounds philosophical, but its practical implications were enormous. An American patrol crashing through the Vietnamese bush thought in terms of sectors, objectives, and extraction points. An Australian SAS patrol, trained in methods that drew from the deepest well of human hunting experience, thought in terms of prey behavior, tracking signatures, and ambush ecology. This predatory mindset was the psychological foundation upon which the practice of carrying battlefield materials was built. When you train a man to think like a hunter rather than a soldier, the line between military operation and predatory pursuit becomes very thin. And when that line dissolves entirely, the things that end up in rucksacks start to reflect something far more primal than military doctrine. But even the Aboriginal tracking methods and the Malayan jungle hardening do not fully explain what the Americans found. Because there was another practice, one the Australians guarded more closely than any other, that turned the contents of those packs from disturbing into genuinely terrifying. And that practice involved boots. The Australian SAS boot ritual is one of the most enduring and controversial aspects of their Vietnam-era operations, and it is directly connected to the broader practice of carrying battlefield materials. Multiple American observers documented what they described as a modification to enemy footwear that Australian operators performed at engagement sites before departing. The specific modification involved cutting or altering captured enemy sandals and boots in patterns that carried symbolic significance within both the Australian SAS operational culture and, more importantly, within the Vietnamese spiritual belief system. The Australians had studied Vietnamese folk religion and ancestor worship practices with a thoroughness that astonished American intelligence officers. They understood that for many Vietnamese, particularly rural Viet Cong fighters from traditional communities, the treatment of the body and personal effects after passing carried enormous spiritual weight. The boot modifications were designed to exploit these beliefs by creating conditions that, within the Vietnamese spiritual framework, would condemn the fallen fighter to a specific form of spiritual suffering. Whether or not the Australian operators personally believed in these spiritual consequences was entirely irrelevant. What mattered was that the Viet Cong fighters believed it. And when word spread through the guerrilla networks about what the Ma Rung, the jungle phantoms, did to those they caught in the bush, the psychological impact was multiplied 100-fold beyond the actual tactical engagement. American military chaplains who learned about these practices were reportedly appalled. Several filed unofficial protests through religious affairs channels, arguing that the Australian methods constituted a form of spiritual warfare that violated the fundamental principles of the laws of armed conflict. Those protests went nowhere. The Australian command's response, when pressed, was characteristically blunt. The practices worked. Enemy movement through Australian-controlled areas decreased dramatically wherever these methods were employed. Viet Cong recruitment in Phuoc Tuy Province suffered measurably, and Australian casualties remained remarkably low by any standard of comparison. The Americans were left with an uncomfortable equation that no amount of doctrinal debate could resolve. Methods they found morally repugnant were producing better operational results than their own vastly more expensive and technologically sophisticated approach. And the Australians showed no interest whatsoever in moderating their behavior to make their allies more comfortable. But the boot ritual was only one component of a much larger psychological warfare campaign that the Australian SAS waged through the items they carried and the things they left behind. And the next element of that campaign was perhaps the most calculated, the most coldly strategic, and the most devastating of all. The Australians understood something about the Viet Cong command structure that American intelligence had been slow to grasp. The guerrilla network in Phuoc Tuy Province relied heavily on local political officers who maintained morale, discipline, and ideological commitment among fighters who were often poorly trained, poorly equipped, and operating far from their home villages. These political officers, known as cadres, were the nervous system of the Viet Cong infrastructure. Without them, units lost cohesion, discipline collapsed, and fighters deserted in significant numbers. The Australian SAS specifically targeted these cadres not just for elimination, but for the exploitation of their personal effects after engagement. When an Australian patrol successfully engaged and neutralized a Viet Cong cadre, the post-contact procedures were even more thorough than usual. Every document was collected, every personal item was cataloged, and specific materials were selected for a purpose that went beyond intelligence gathering. These materials would be reintroduced into the Viet Cong network through carefully orchestrated channels, sometimes through double agents, sometimes through deliberate placement at locations where they would be found by enemy forces. The condition in which these materials were returned and the modifications that had been made to them sent a message that required no translation. The jungle phantoms know who you are, they know where you operate, and they can reach anyone at any time, regardless of rank or position. The psychological impact of this targeted campaign was documented in captured Viet Cong communications that revealed a level of institutional fear that bordered on superstition. Local commanders began reporting that their fighters refused to operate in areas where the Ma Rung had been active. Recruitment dried up. Movement routes were abandoned. Entire sections of the trail network that had been in use for years were simply left to the jungle because the psychological cost of using them was simply too high. And still the Americans could not bring themselves to officially acknowledge what was happening, because acknowledging it would mean confronting questions they were not prepared to answer. Questions about effectiveness. Questions about morality. And above all, questions about why their own multi-billion-dollar war machine could not match the results of 70 Australians with rucksacks full of nightmares. The classified comparison between Australian and American kill ratios in Vietnam remains one of the most sensitive documents in the history of Allied military cooperation. The numbers, when they finally emerged through declassification processes decades after the war ended, painted a picture that the Pentagon had very good reasons to keep hidden. Australian SAS operators in Phuoc Tuy Province achieved engagement ratios that were, by some estimates, more than 500% higher than comparable American special operations units operating in similar terrain during the same period. The casualty exchange rates were even more dramatic. For every Australian SAS operator who fell in combat during the entire Vietnam deployment, the unit accounted for a number of enemy casualties that remains a matter of debate among military historians. But that all credible analyses place in a range that makes American special operations performance look, to put it diplomatically, deeply inefficient. These numbers created a bureaucratic crisis within the American military establishment. If the Australian methods were demonstrably more effective, then the entire American approach to special operations in Vietnam was called into question. And since the American approach relied on billions of dollars of technology, vast logistical infrastructure, and a doctrinal philosophy that justified the military-industrial complex's central role in national defense, the implications extended far beyond Vietnam. Acknowledging Australian superiority meant acknowledging that small, lightly equipped units using unconventional psychological methods could outperform the most technologically advanced military force in human history. The Pentagon's solution was elegant in its simplicity. They classified everything: the comparative performance data, the field reports from American observers at Nui Dat, The medical processing reports that documented what was found in Australian rucksacks, the intelligence assessments that credited Australian psychological warfare methods with disrupting Viet Cong operations far beyond what American firepower had achieved. All of it disappeared into classified archives where it would remain, theoretically forever, invisible to the American public and to the broader military community. But secrets have a way of rotting through their containers, especially when the containers are human memories. And the men who had seen what was inside those rucksacks were about to become a problem that no amount of classification stamps could solve. The psychological impact on American medical personnel who processed returning Australian SAS patrols became, in itself, a classified concern. In 1969, the U.S. Army Medical Command quietly commissioned a study on what it termed Allied force processing stress among medical staff at facilities that regularly handled Australian SAS debriefings. The study, which was never formally published but whose existence was confirmed through Freedom of Information requests filed in the early 2000s, reportedly identified a pattern of psychological symptoms among American medics who had been exposed to the contents of Australian patrol packs. These symptoms included acute nausea responses that persisted for days after exposure, recurring intrusive thoughts about the materials encountered, avoidance behavior that manifested as transfer requests and duty reassignment applications, and in several cases, a persistent fascination that the study authors found equally concerning. Some medics reported that after their initial shock subsided, they found themselves seeking out opportunities to process Australian patrols again, drawn by a compulsion they could neither explain nor control. The study recommended that Australian SAS medical processing be handled exclusively by Australian medical personnel, a recommendation that was implemented within months and that effectively walled off any further American observation of what those packs contained. That firewall held for the remainder of the war, but the stories had already escaped, and they were spreading through American military culture like spores from a jungle fungus that no amount of institutional disinfectant could eliminate. One particularly persistent account involves a 1968 incident at the American Evacuation Hospital at Vung Tau, where an Australian SAS operator was brought in with a non-combat injury sustained during a patrol extraction. The operator was unconscious, and American medical staff began the standard procedure of removing his equipment to treat his injuries. When they opened his pack to clear it from the treatment area, several items fell onto the hospital floor. The attending nurse, a 23-year-old from Ohio who had been in country for 4 months, began screaming and did not stop until she was physically removed from the treatment area by 2 orderlies. The nurse was immediately evacuated to Japan for psychiatric evaluation and never returned to Vietnam. The official incident report listed the cause of her breakdown as cumulative combat stress unrelated to any specific event. The unofficial account, preserved in the private diaries of 3 separate medical personnel who were present that day, tells a very different story entirely. The items that fell from the Australian operator's pack were described in those private accounts with a specificity that leaves no room for misinterpretation. And the fact that the operator had been carrying those items during what was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance patrol, not a combat engagement, suggested something that shook the American observers to their core. The practice of carrying such materials had become so normalized within Australian SAS culture that operators no longer distinguished between engagement-specific trophies and standard patrol equipment. This normalization was, in many ways, the most disturbing aspect of the entire phenomenon, and it pointed directly to a transformation happening inside the operators themselves, a transformation that American military psychologists were watching with a mixture of professional fascination and genuine alarm. The transformation that Australian SAS operators underwent during their deployments was a subject of intense, unofficial study by American military psychologists who observed the Australians at Nui Dat and during joint operations. These observers noted a progressive change in operators that typically accelerated after their 3rd or 4th long-range patrol. The change was not dramatic in any single moment. It was cumulative, subtle, and by the time it was fully manifest, the operator had become something that his pre-deployment self would barely recognize. The earliest signs were physical. Operators lost weight rapidly despite adequate caloric intake, their bodies burning fuel at rates that suggested constant autonomic nervous system activation. Their eyes developed what one American psychologist described as a tracking quality, a tendency to follow movement in their peripheral vision with a speed and intensity that was more predatory than military. Their personal hygiene habits changed in ways that initially puzzled observers. Operators who had been fastidiously clean before deployment began to resist showering after patrols, not from laziness, but from what appeared to be a reluctance to remove the scent of the jungle from their bodies. Several operators were observed applying mud and vegetation to their skin, even when within the secure perimeter of Nui Dat, as if the boundary between patrol and garrison had ceased to exist in their minds. They developed an insider vocabulary that excluded not just Americans, but also conventional Australian soldiers. They referred to patrols not as operations or missions, but as hunts. They referred to enemy forces with terminology drawn from animal predation. And they referred to the items they carried back from those hunts with a casual familiarity that made clear those items were not exceptions to their operational routine, but central to it. The American psychologists who observed this transformation were simultaneously fascinated and alarmed. They recognized the pattern from studies of elite predatory units throughout military history, but the Australian SAS case was notable for the speed and completeness of the change. Where other military organizations had tried to moderate or contain similar tendencies in their elite units, the Australian SAS command structure appeared to actively cultivate them. The unofficial motto was simple: if it works in the bush, it stays in the bush. And whatever happened in the bush was the patrol's business and no one else's. But this institutional permissiveness was not just a management philosophy. It was a ticking time bomb with a fuse measured not in years, but in generations. Because the practices being protected behind that wall of silence were not staying static. They were evolving. This institutional permissiveness created a closed system in which practices could develop without external oversight, and the direction of that development was consistently toward greater psychological extremity. Each patrol pushed the boundaries slightly further. Each successful engagement validated methods that would have been unthinkable in a conventional military context. And each returning patrol carried evidence of that evolution in their rucksacks. Evidence that the American medical personnel were the only outsiders ever forced to confront directly. The cycle was self-reinforcing. Success justified the methods. The methods produced success, and the men who executed them became progressively more detached from any external frame of reference that might have imposed limits. The regiment was writing its own rules in the blood and mud of Phuoc Tuy Province, and there was no editor, no reviewer, and no authority outside the patrol that had any say in what those rules contained. But the story of the Australian SAS and their jungle souvenirs does not end in Vietnam. Not even close, because the practices developed in those jungles had consequences that would reach across decades and continents, consequences that would eventually detonate in the full glare of international media attention. The veterans who returned from Vietnam carried more than physical souvenirs. They carried methods, mindsets, and memories that would shape the Australian Special Air Service Regiment for the next 50 years. The operators who had been transformed by the jungle did not simply revert to their pre-deployment selves when they stepped off the plane in Perth. Many of them remained in the regiment, rising through the ranks to become patrol commanders, squadron leaders, and eventually the institutional architects of modern Australian special operations doctrine. And they brought with them the fundamental lesson of Vietnam. Intimate, psychologically confrontational warfare works. It works better than technology. It works better than firepower. And the cost, measured in the psychological transformation of the operators who wage it, is a cost that the regiment was willing to pay. This institutional inheritance meant that the practices first documented in Vietnam did not disappear when the war ended. They evolved, they were refined, and they were transmitted to successive generations of SAS operators through a training culture that valued direct experience above all other forms of knowledge. The old hands, the Vietnam veterans who stayed in the regiment, taught the new intake not just how to move through the bush, but how to think in the bush. How to shed the psychological constraints of civilian identity, how to become what the jungle required them to become, and the new intake, eager to prove themselves worthy of the regiment's fearsome reputation, absorbed those lessons with an enthusiasm that would eventually prove catastrophic. The seeds planted in the rice paddies and jungle trails of Phuoc Tuy Province were about to bloom in the mountains and valleys of a very different war. And when they did, the harvest would shock an entire nation. The legacy of the Australian SAS jungle souvenirs surfaced with explosive force when the Australian government established the Brereton Inquiry in 2016 to investigate allegations of unlawful conduct by Australian special forces in Afghanistan. The inquiry, which released its findings in 2020 after 4 years of investigation, detailed a culture within the SAS that the report described as a self-centered warrior culture at odds with the Army's values and standards. What has received far less attention than the headline findings is the direct institutional lineage between the practices documented in that report and the practices first developed in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province more than half a century earlier. The Vietnam-era operators who created the psychological warfare techniques, the post-engagement procedures, and the culture of carrying battlefield materials did not simply retire and disappear. They built the institutional culture that trained the next generation and the generation after that in an unbroken chain of transmission that stretched from 1966 to the mountains of Uruzgan province. The Brereton inquiry identified what it called a culture of secrecy and institutional protection that prevented oversight and accountability. This was precisely the same institutional dynamic that had shielded the Vietnam-era practices from American observation and that had allowed the post-engagement procedures to evolve without external constraint for decades. The inquiry found that senior operators initiated junior soldiers into practices that went beyond standard operational procedures, a process of acculturation that bore striking similarities to the transformation documented by American psychologists at Nui Dat in the late 1960s. And the inquiry found that the culture of the regiment actively suppressed reporting by individuals who had concerns about what they had witnessed, a pattern of institutional silence that had its roots in the Vietnam-era motto about what happens in the bush, staying in the bush. The connection between Vietnam and Afghanistan is not speculation. It is a documented institutional reality that the Australian Defence Force has been forced to confront in the most public and painful way possible. The rucksacks of Phuoc Tuy and the allegations of Uruzgan are separated by decades and thousands of miles, but they are connected by a direct line of cultural transmission that makes them, in essence, chapters of the same unfinished story. But before that reckoning arrived, there was still the matter of what the Americans who witnessed the original Australian methods chose to do with their knowledge. And the answer to that question reveals as much about the American military establishment as it does about the Australians themselves. The American intelligence community's response to the Australian SAS phenomenon was characterized by a tension that was never fully resolved. On one hand, the results were undeniable. The Australians were achieving operational outcomes in Phuoc Tuy Province that American units could not match, despite having access to resources that dwarfed the Australian allocation by orders of magnitude. On the other hand, the methods that produced those results were so far outside American doctrinal and legal frameworks that adopting them was essentially impossible. The Pentagon was trapped between the desire to learn from Australian success and the inability to acknowledge the nature of that success without opening a moral and legal Pandora's box that could never be closed. The compromise position, adopted informally throughout the American command structure in Vietnam, was one of deliberate ignorance. American officers who were aware of Australian methods were tacitly discouraged from documenting them in official channels. When documentation was unavoidable, as in the medical processing reports, the language was carefully crafted to obscure the specific nature of the materials encountered. The phrase non-standard battlefield materials became the bureaucratic shorthand for items that no bureaucratic language could adequately describe. And the policy of transferring Australian medical processing to Australian personnel ensured that the flow of uncomfortable information from the field to the American command was permanently interrupted. This deliberate ignorance served American institutional interests perfectly. It allowed the Pentagon to maintain the fiction that all Allied forces in Vietnam operated within the same legal and ethical framework. It prevented uncomfortable questions from being asked in congressional hearings or press briefings. And it preserved the American self-image as the dominant military power in the theater, unblemished by association with methods that could be characterized as primitive or uncivilized. But the cost of that deliberate ignorance was staggering, and it was paid not in dollars, but in lessons that were never learned and lives that were never saved. The Australian SAS had discovered something fundamental about the nature of jungle warfare, something that went beyond specific tactical techniques to touch on the very psychology of human conflict. They discovered that in an environment where technology is neutralized by terrain, where air power is blinded by canopy, and where the enemy knows the ground better than any foreign force ever will, the most powerful weapon available is the human capacity for psychological transformation. The willingness to become something other than what civilized society has made you. The ability to operate in the space between soldier and predator, between military operation and primal hunt. The Australian SAS found that space and lived in it. The Americans looked at it, recoiled, and walked away. And walking away meant that when the next jungle war came, and the next after that, American forces would make the same mistakes, rely on the same technological solutions, and wonder why small groups of lightly equipped fighters continued to outperform them in environments where technology offered no advantage. The lessons of Phuoc Tuy remained locked in classified files, and the fading memories of men who had been ordered not to speak of what they had seen. But some of those men did speak. And their accounts, emerging gradually through memoirs, interviews, and declassification requests filed over the decades following the war, collectively constructed a picture that no official history could withstand. One of the most detailed accounts comes from a retired American Special Forces sergeant who served as a liaison with Australian forces in 1968 and 1969. His memoir, self-published in the early 2000s after decades of silence, dedicates an entire chapter to his experiences observing Australian SAS patrol procedures. He describes with clinical precision the post-engagement rituals he witnessed during a joint operation in the Rungset Special Zone, one of the most heavily contested areas in the Mekong Delta region. His account, while carefully written to avoid the most explicit details, makes clear that what the Australian operators did at engagement sites was systematic, rehearsed, and conducted with the calm efficiency of a medical procedure rather than the frenzied violence of a combat aftermath. He notes that the most senior operator in the patrol, a warrant officer with 3 previous tours, supervised the post-engagement procedures with what he describes as the detached professionalism of a surgeon conducting a routine operation. There was no emotion visible in any of the operators. No anger, no revulsion, no excitement. Just methodical, purposeful activity, conducted in near silence, punctuated only by quiet hand signals and the occasional whispered instruction. The entire procedure, from the moment the last round was fired to the moment the patrol began its withdrawal from the engagement site, took approximately 90 minutes. During that time, the operators collected, processed, and packed materials that the American sergeant knew he would never be able to discuss in any official capacity. His memoir concludes that chapter with a reflection that captures the essential paradox of the Australian SAS experience. He writes that the men he observed that night were simultaneously the most professional soldiers he had ever served alongside and the most disturbing human beings he had ever encountered. They were superb at what they did, but what they did belonged to a category of warfare that exists outside any framework he was trained to evaluate. That assessment, written decades after the events it describes, remains the most honest evaluation of the Australian SAS jungle souvenir phenomenon ever committed to paper by an American serviceman. And it carries a weight that no classified report or sanitized official history can match, because it comes from a man who was there, who saw the rucksacks opened, and who understood exactly what he was looking at. But even his account, powerful as it is, captures only one moment in time. The full scope of the phenomenon required the testimony of dozens of witnesses across multiple years of the war. And when those testimonies are assembled side by side, the picture they paint is not of isolated incidents or rogue operators, but of a systematic institutional practice that was as much a part of Australian SAS operations as map reading or weapons maintenance. The Viet Cong, for their part, left their own assessment of the Australian methods in their operational communications. Captured documents from the 1968 period contain repeated references to the Mae Rung, the jungle phantoms, and the instructions issued to guerrilla fighters regarding Australian-controlled zones are notable for their tone of genuine fear. One district-level directive recovered during Operation Coburg instructed fighters to avoid contact with Australian patrols at all costs, noting that the methods employed by these forces go beyond military engagement and represent a form of warfare against the spirit itself. Another communication, intercepted in late 1967, warned that fighters who encountered evidence of Australian activity on their trail networks should abandon those routes permanently, as the spiritual contamination left by the phantoms could not be remedied by any known ritual. These captured documents represent perhaps the most objective assessment of the Australian SAS psychological warfare campaign available. They were not written for an audience. They were not crafted to shape a narrative. They were operational communications written by men who were genuinely terrified of what they were facing, and their fear validates every disturbing item found in every Australian rucksack that an American medic was unfortunate enough to open. The effectiveness was never in question. The Australians owned the jungle in Phuoc Tuy Province in a way that no American unit ever owned any comparable territory during the entire war. They owned it not through superior firepower or technological advantage, but through a willingness to wage warfare at a level of psychological intimacy that no other force in the theater could match. The items in their packs were the physical evidence of that intimacy, the receipts of a transaction between hunter and hunted that the rest of the military world found too disturbing to examine. And that is precisely why those items made American medics physically ill. Not because the medics were weak or inexperienced. Many of them had treated the most grievous combat injuries imaginable. They had held men together with their bare hands while medevac helicopters fought through hostile fire to reach their position, and they had performed surgery in the mud, in the dark, under mortar fire. These were not men and women who were easily shaken by the realities of war. What shook them was not the violence implied by the rucksack contents. What shook them was the calculation, the methodology, the calm, systematic, institutional nature of what those contents represented. Random battlefield violence is comprehensible. It is chaotic, emotional, and human in its very disorder. What the American medics found in Australian packs was none of those things. It was ordered, it was purposeful, and it suggested a relationship with the mechanics of conflict that existed beyond the boundaries of anything their training had prepared them to understand. The instruction that eventually became standard among American medical units, that simple warning not to touch Australian gear, was not born from squeamishness. It was born from a recognition that those rucksacks contained the evidence of a world the American military had chosen not to enter. A world where effectiveness was measured not in territory seized or positions held, but in the depth of psychological devastation inflicted upon an enemy, through methods that defied categorization by any standard moral framework. The Americans drew a line. The Australians erased it. And the space between those two positions is where the true history of special operations in Vietnam actually lives. That history has been buried for more than half a century beneath layers of classification, institutional embarrassment, and the simple human desire to forget things that make the stomach turn. But it has not disappeared. It lives in the declassified fragments that emerge periodically from national archives. It lives in the memoirs of American veterans who can no longer keep their silence. It lives in the findings of the Brereton Inquiry, which trace the roots of modern Australian Special Forces culture back to the very practices that American medics encountered in those rucksacks at Long Binh, Vung Tau, and Nui Dat. And it lives in the single most frequently repeated sentence in every American account of the Australian SAS in Vietnam. A sentence that was never written in any official document, but that was spoken so often by so many different men in so many different locations across the theater that it achieved the status of unofficial military doctrine. Do not touch their gear. That sentence carries within it the entire weight of a hidden military rivalry, a suppressed operational history, and a moral reckoning that took 50 years to arrive. It is the simplest possible summary of the most complex story in the history of Allied special operations. And it is the only warning that the American military ever issued about the Australian SAS that every single person who heard it took with absolute, unquestioning seriousness. Because the men who ignored it learned in the most visceral way possible exactly what the jungle phantoms brought back from the darkness, and not one of them was ever the same again.